Before we start, I ask you to subscribe. Tell us where you're from and don't forget to leave a like. I've always found solace in the open road. There's something therapeutic about watching the yellow lines disappear beneath your car, mile after mile, as the world around you transforms into an endless canvas of possibilities. That's what I told myself when I decided to embark on this photography project through Arizona, capturing the forgotten corners of Route 66, where time seems to stand still. Looking back now, I wish I had listened to that nagging feeling in my gut telling me to stay home. The morning started like any other day on the road. I checked out of another forgettable motel just before sunrise, my camera gear safely packed in the trunk of my Honda Civic. The desert air was crisp, and the sky painted in shades of purple and orange that photographers like me live for. I'd been on the road for 3 days, documenting abandoned buildings and interviewing locals about the old stories that seemed to seep from every crack in the weathered asphalt of America's most famous highway. It wasn't until around noon that I first noticed the black sedan in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, Route 66 might be less traveled these days, but it's still a public highway. The car kept a consistent distance, never getting too close or falling too far behind. It was like watching a shadow that refused to fade, no matter how the sun moved across the sky. 3 hours later, that same car was still there, maintaining that exact same distance, like a well-rehearsed dance partner who never missed a step. I tried to rationalize it away. Maybe they were heading to the same destination, or perhaps it was just coincidence. But something about the way that car moved made my skin crawl. It matched every lane change, every slight variation in speed, every curve in the road with mechanical precision. I found myself checking the rearview mirror more frequently, my knuckles whitening against the steering wheel. The desert landscape that had seemed so beautiful this morning now felt oppressive, its vast emptiness a reminder of just how alone I was out here. The tension built slowly, like a photograph developing in darkroom chemicals. I tried playing games with myself, making sudden lane changes or varying my speed dramatically, but the distance between us remained unchanged. The sun was starting to sink lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the highway, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted rather than followed. My rational mind kept trying to dismiss the fear, but something primitive inside me was screaming that this wasn't normal, that this wasn't just another car on the road. As dusk approached, I made a decision that would change everything. My gas gauge was hovering around a quarter tank, and I spotted a sign for a service station 5 miles ahead. I figured it would force whoever was behind me to either pass by or stop as well. Finally breaking this maddening pattern, what I didn't expect was what happened next. As I took the exit toward the gas station, I watched in my rearview mirror as the black sedan simply vanished. No turn-off, no sudden acceleration or deceleration. It was there one moment and gone the next, like a mirage dissolving in the desert heat. That's when the real horror began. The fluorescent lights of the gas station buzzed overhead like angry wasps, casting an unnatural glow across the empty parking lot. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled up to the pump, my eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of the black sedan. The station seemed frozen in time, an aging relic from the 1960s with rust-spotted gas pumps and faded advertisements peeling from the windows. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft ping of my cooling engine. The man behind the counter didn't look up when I entered the store. He was reading something, his face obscured by a worn baseball cap, but I could feel his attention shift the moment the bell above the door announced my presence. "Regular unleaded for pump 3, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Without looking up, he replied, "Rough drive from Flagstaff, wasn't it, Miss Cooper?" My blood turned to ice. I hadn't told him my name, and I certainly hadn't mentioned where I'd been. "Your camera equipment still in the trunk. That Nikon D850 is quite the investment," he continued, finally raising his head. His eyes were an unsettling shade of pale blue, almost colorless in the harsh lighting. My hand instinctively went to my jacket pocket, where I kept my car keys. "How did you..." I started, but he cut me off with a smile that didn't reach those haunting eyes. We get all types passing through here, especially photographers. Something about this stretch of road just calls to them, though not many stick around long enough to capture what they're looking for. As he spoke, I noticed the wall behind him, covered in missing person posters, yellowed with age. My eyes were drawn to one in particular, a woman, maybe a few years older than me, holding a camera. The date on the poster was from 3 years ago. Then I saw another, and another, all photographers, all disappeared along this same stretch of Route 66. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't coincidence. The man's smile widened as he watched understanding dawn on my face. I backed toward the door, my heart thundering in my chest. Through the store's grimy windows, I could see my car sitting alone under the flickering lights of the pump station. But in the reflection of the glass, something impossible appeared. The black sedan, parked directly behind my car. When I spun around to look through the actual window, there was nothing there, just empty space and dancing shadows. The man's chuckle drew my attention back to the counter, but he wasn't there anymore. The space behind the register was empty, as if he'd never existed. That's when I noticed the photographs scattered across the counter, dozens of them, all taken along Route 66. With shaking hands, I picked one up, and my world tilted sideways. It was a photo of me from earlier that day, standing beside my car at a scenic overlook. But I hadn't seen anyone else there. I hadn't heard a camera. In the background of the photo, barely visible but unmistakable, was the black sedan, and through its windshield, I could make out the face of the man who had just vanished, wearing the same baseball cap, the same unsettling smile, his pale eyes reflecting the sunlight like mirrors. The revelation hit me like a tidal wave. My grandfather's stories weren't just folklore. As a child, I'd listened with wide eyes as he spoke of a mysterious stretch of Route 66, where reality wore thin, where photographers disappeared because they captured something they were never meant to see. He wasn't senile or imaginative. He was trying to warn me. The leather-bound journal I'd found in his attic last month, filled with bizarre symbols and desperate warnings, now made perfect sense. I wasn't here by chance. I'd been drawn here just like all the others. The photographs on the counter began to organize themselves, forming a complex pattern that matched the symbols in my grandfather's journal. Each image was a piece of a larger puzzle, a map of sorts, but not of physical locations. These were coordinates in a different kind of space, marking points where the boundary between our world and something else had grown dangerously thin. The black sedan wasn't just a vehicle, it was a sentinel, patrolling these weakened borders, and its driver, the man with the pale eyes, was its keeper. My hands moved of their own accord, arranging and rearranging the photographs until they formed a perfect circle. In the center, a new image appeared, one I hadn't seen before. It showed my grandfather, decades younger, standing in this very store. He was holding a camera, but his expression was different from the other trapped photographers. He wasn't afraid, he was determined, and in his other hand, he held what looked like an ancient key, covered in the same symbols that decorated his journal. The air in the store grew thick with static electricity, and the fluorescent lights overhead began to pulse in a complex rhythm. Each pulse revealed glimpses of another reality superimposed over our own, a vast, geometric landscape that defied physics and reason. The man with the pale eyes appeared again, but this time I saw him for what he truly was. His human form was just a disguise, a convenient facade for something far more ancient and terrible. Through the windows I could see the black sedan transforming, its sleek modern lines melting and reforming into something that looked like it had been designed by MC. Escher having a nightmare. The missing photographers weren't just gone. They had become part of this place, their creative energies feeding whatever force held this reality together. Their cameras hadn't just captured images, they had captured fragments of their souls, slowly draining them until they became one with the twisted geometry of this threshold world. The key to everything lay in my grandfather's final photograph. He hadn't disappeared like the others because he had understood the true nature of this place. Photography wasn't just an art form here, it was a language, a way to communicate with whatever existed on the other side of reality's thin veil. Each photograph was a word, each collection a sentence, and together they told a story of power, sacrifice, and the price of seeing too much. My grandfather had learned to speak this language, and now, facing the same entity that had confronted him decades ago, I realized that I had to do the same, or become just another missing person poster on the wall. Time had lost all meaning in this place between realities. The store's interior had become a kaleidoscope of shifting dimensions, where every surface reflected a different version of truth. I held my camera before me like a shield, understanding now that it wasn't just a tool. It was a weapon, perhaps the only one that could affect the being that called itself the Curator. My grandfather's journal had prepared me for this moment, though I hadn't known it until now. The man with the pale eyes stood before me, his form flickering between human and something that hurt to look at directly. "Your grandfather was clever," he said, his voice resonating on frequencies that made my teeth ache. He understood the rules of this place, but he cheated. He found a way to capture images without becoming one himself. But you, Riley, you have something he never had. You have the ability to not just capture reality, but to reshape it. The photographs around us began to move, swirling through the air like autumn leaves caught in a whirlwind. Each one contained a fragment of a soul, a piece of creative energy that the Curator had been collecting for decades. But there was a pattern to their movement, a desperate message that the trapped photographers were trying to convey. My camera's viewfinder showed what my naked eyes couldn't see, the true form of this place and the weaknesses in its structure. With trembling hands, I raised my camera and began to shoot. Each click of the shutter was like a thunderclap in this distorted reality, but I wasn't taking normal photographs. I was capturing the spaces between moments, the gaps in reality where the Curator's power couldn't reach. The being realized what I was doing too late. Each image I captured was like a key, unlocking the bonds that held the other photographers in this dimensional prison. The black sedan outside began to dissolve, its metal frame melting into impossible geometries as its true nature was exposed. The missing photographers' images began to separate from their prison of paper and emulsion, their essences reforming into something approaching their original selves. The Curator's power over them was breaking, but its rage was becoming tangible, distorting the air like heat waves over hot asphalt. In a final, desperate act, I turned my camera toward the Curator itself. Through the viewfinder, I could see its true form, a being of pure geometry and void, existing in dimensions that human minds weren't meant to comprehend. But my grandfather's journal had taught me what to look for, the specific angles and patterns that made up its fundamental structure. With one last press of the shutter, I captured not its image but its essence, trapping the trapper in its own game. The world seemed to hold its breath for a moment, and then reality came crashing back with the force of a tsunami. The store reformed around us, but changed. The missing person posters were blank. The photographs on the counter nothing more than empty paper. The freed photographers stood in bewildered groups, solid and real once more. Outside, Route 66 stretched away in both directions, unmarred by any sign of the black sedan. The Curator was gone, trapped in the last photograph I would ever take with that camera. In the distance, the sun was rising, painting the desert in shades of hope rather than fear. Sometimes, I still think I see that black sedan in my rearview mirror, but I know better now. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled alone, and some stories need to be told so that others might survive their own encounters with the spaces between what is real and what is merely photographed. The flickering fluorescent lights of the security office cast an eerie glow across the bank of monitors before me. I've worked security for 15 years, but something about Ravenwood Psychiatric Hospital made my skin crawl from the moment I accepted this position. The building's imposing Victorian architecture, with its weather-worn brick facade and countless darkened windows, seemed to watch me as I made my way through the entrance for my first night shift. The still air inside carried the lingering scent of antiseptic and decay, a reminder of the countless souls who had passed through these halls over the decades. The job seemed straightforward enough when I interviewed. monitor the cameras, make hourly rounds, and ensure no teenagers or homeless people tried to break in. The pay was better than my last gig, and honestly, I needed the money. Divorce isn't cheap, and Janet made sure to take everything she could. I didn't expect much excitement. The hospital had been abandoned for 23 years, its doors sealed after a series of controversial deaths that the local papers had called suspicious circumstances. But sitting here now, surrounded by the gentle hum of outdated equipment and the occasional distant creak of settling walls, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really alone. My eyes drifted across the monitors, each showing a different section of the sprawling facility. The East Wing, where they once housed the most dangerous patients, remained in perpetual darkness due to electrical issues. The Children's Ward, perhaps the most depressing area, still had faded murals of cartoon characters on its walls, their cheerful faces now grotesque and peeling. The administrative section, where I sat, was the only area with reliable power, though the lights still flickered occasionally as if possessed by some restless spirit. I pulled out the facility map they'd given me during orientation, studying the layout for my first round. The previous guard had left detailed notes about which areas to avoid due to structural damage, but something about his hurried handwriting suggested there might have been other reasons he didn't want anyone going to certain places. I'd have to make my first patrol soon, checking the locks and ensuring all entry points remained secure. The thought of walking those dark corridors alone made my palms sweat, but I told myself it was just first night jitters. The digital clock on my desk clicked over to 11,000 p.m., its red numbers casting a bloody tinge across my coffee cup. As I stood to begin my rounds, a strange sound caught my attention. Footsteps clear as day, echoing from the floor above. I froze, coffee cup halfway to my mouth, and glanced at the second floor monitors. Nothing but empty hallways stared back at me, their shadows playing tricks in the dim emergency lighting. I told myself it was just the building settling, but even as the thought formed, the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving across the ceiling in a precise pattern. A quick check of my tablet showed no motion sensor alerts, and the thermal cameras displayed nothing but the cold, blue emptiness of abandoned rooms. Yet the footsteps persisted, growing louder, more purposeful. They seemed to be following the exact path I'd planned for my first round, as if someone or something was marking the way ahead of me. When they reached the stairwell leading down to my floor, they stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence so complete it made my ears ring. In that moment, staring at the empty screens before me, I realized this wouldn't be the simple job I'd imagined. Something waited in the darkness of Ravenwood, and somehow, I knew it had been expecting me. My hands trembled as I pulled open the desk drawer, searching for anything that might explain the footsteps above. Among the scattered paperwork and old maintenance logs, I found a leather-bound journal, its pages yellow with age. The name Dr. Malcolm Pierce was embossed on the cover, barely visible in the dim light. Opening it sent a cloud of dust into the air, and the musty scent of decades past filled my nostrils. The entries dated back to 1987, just months before the hospital's closure. The doctor's handwriting grew increasingly erratic as I turned the pages, describing experiments that made my blood run cold. They'd been testing new treatments on patients, pushing the boundaries of ethical medicine under the guise of breakthrough therapy. But it was the mention of Project Echo that caught my eye, a series of trials involving sensory deprivation and experimental drugs. The patients reported hearing footsteps when alone, seeing shadows move against the laws of physics, and experiencing memories that weren't their own. Dr. Pierce's notes suggested these weren't hallucinations, but something far more sinister. Another set of footsteps echoed above, this time accompanied by the sound of dragging metal. The security cameras still showed empty corridors, but the thermal imaging system suddenly flickered to life. A cold spot, impossibly cold, moved slowly across the second floor, following the same path as the footsteps. My heart pounded as I watched the temperature readings drop further, well below what should be possible. The spot paused directly above my office, and I could swear I heard breathing, ragged, labored breathing, coming through the ceiling tiles. The journal's final entries became almost unintelligible, filled with frantic warnings about the breach and what we let in. Dr. Pierce wrote about a patient named Sarah Winters, a young woman who'd been the first success in Project Echo. She'd demonstrated unprecedented abilities, but something went wrong. The last entry, dated the day before the hospital's closure, contained just 3 words: "She found us." A chill ran down my spine as I noticed the date. Exactly 23 years ago tonight, the power in my office flickered, and for a moment, I saw a reflection in one of the dark monitors. A woman in a hospital gown, her head tilted at an impossible angle. Forcing myself to stay calm, I began digging through more records stored in the office. A personnel file caught my attention, my own, but this wasn't from my hiring last week. This file was old, yellowed like the journal. With trembling hands, I opened it and felt my world tilt sideways. There, in a faded photograph, was my face, but the name read David Foster. The admission date was 1986, and under relationship to patient, it listed brother of Sarah Winters. Memories I never knew I had began flooding back. Fragments of a childhood spent visiting this place, watching through observation windows as doctors experimented on my sister. The lights went out completely, plunging the office into darkness, broken only by the glow of the monitors. Each screen began to show the same image, a figure standing at the end of different corridors, all facing the cameras. In the darkness, I heard a voice, barely a whisper but achingly familiar. "You finally came back, Derek. Or should I call you David?" The temperature dropped so rapidly I could see my breath, and the door to my office slowly began to open, hinges creaking in the silence. As I stared into the darkness beyond, I realized I hadn't taken this job by chance. Something had called me here, wanting me to remember. The emergency lights kicked in, bathing the corridors in a sickly red glow. I bolted from my office, my footsteps echoing off the walls as I ran toward the main entrance. The exit signs flickered mockingly as I approached, their green luminescence creating dancing shadows that seemed to reach for me. When I reached the heavy double doors, my heart sank. The electronic locks had engaged, sealed by the power failure. I was trapped inside Ravenwood with whatever had been awakened by my presence. My radio crackled to life, emitting bursts of static interspersed with what sounded like backward speech. Through the white noise, I could make out fragments of conversations, medical procedures, screaming patients, and beneath it all, a child's voice calling my name, not Derek, but David. The memories were becoming clearer now, sitting in starched waiting rooms, watching through one-way glass as men in white coats circled my sister like vultures. I'd been so young when they convinced our parents to commit her, barely 10 years old. The guilt of failing to protect her had been too much. I'd chosen to forget. The sound of rolling wheels drew my attention to the far end of the corridor. A wheelchair emerged from the darkness, moving on its own, leaving wet tracks on the floor. As it got closer, I noticed the seats and wheels were rusted, as if it had been submerged in water for years. It stopped halfway down the hall, and in its reflection on the polished floor, I saw someone sitting in it, a young woman in a soaking wet hospital gown. When I looked directly at the chair, it was empty. The temperature around me plummeted, and I heard that whispered voice again. "Remember the basement, David? Remember what they did to us down there?" Fighting against every instinct telling me to run, I made my way to the basement access door. The keycard reader was dead, but the door swung open at my touch as if inviting me in. The stairwell descended into absolute darkness, the emergency lights having failed to penetrate this deep. My flashlight beam revealed walls covered in claw marks, some old and rusted, others seemingly fresh. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy steel door stood ajar, the entrance to a ward that didn't appear on any of the hospital's official maps. Inside, I found a maze of smaller rooms, each equipped with restraint chairs and observation windows. The air was thick with the smell of mold and something metallic, old blood. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness, and my flashlight beam caught glimpses of medical equipment that looked more like instruments of torture. On one wall, a massive mirror stretched from floor to ceiling, cracked but still intact. As I approached, my reflection changed. I saw myself as a child, holding hands with my sister while our parents signed the commitment papers. Then the image shifted, showing Sarah strapped to a chair, doctors surrounding her with needles and electrodes while I watched helplessly from behind the glass. The mirror exploded outward suddenly, sending shards of glass flying in all directions. Through the empty frame, I saw a hidden room beyond, a circular chamber filled with sensory deprivation tanks. They were arranged like spokes on a wheel, all connected to a central control station. Most were empty, their glass clouded with age, but one still contained liquid, dark and thick like ink. As I approached, something moved beneath the surface, and a hand pressed against the glass from inside. The emergency lights chose that moment to sputter to life, revealing the tank's occupant, a body suspended in the murky fluid, eyes wide open and staring directly at me. The face was mine, but not as I look now. It was me as a young man, preserved exactly as I'd looked 23 years ago. The walls of Ravenwood began to pulse like a living thing, the barrier between realities growing thinner with each beat. I ran through the corridors, chased by the rising dark water that had now reached the upper floors. Behind me I could hear Sarah's laughter, echoing from every direction, multiplied and distorted until it became a chorus of voices. The security office was flooded when I reached it, my desk floating like driftwood in the inky liquid that had consumed the building's lower levels. Every monitor displayed the same image now, the sensory deprivation tank where my body had been preserved. But the perspective was from inside, looking out through the glass at my own face pressed against it. The truth hit me with devastating clarity. I hadn't been watching security cameras all night. I'd been watching through Sarah's eyes as she guided me through the memories of our past. The Derek Foster who had taken this job, who had lived a life thinking he was someone else, was just another echo, a fragment of consciousness she had kept alive while working to free us both. The liquid rose faster now, swallowing everything in its path, in its depths. I could see other versions of Ravenwood superimposed over each other. The hospital, as it had been in its prime, as it was now, and as it existed in the space between dimensions where Sarah had been trapped. Through the windows, I watched the night sky transform, stars blinking out one by one as reality began to unravel around the building. This was what the doctors had feared, the breach they had sacrificed everything to contain. Sarah appeared before me, but not as the patient she had been. Her form shifted constantly, sometimes the young woman I remembered, sometimes a being of pure darkness with stars wheeling in its depths. They thought they could control it, she said, her voice resonating through every molecule of air. They thought they could harness what lies between worlds, but they only succeeded in trapping us here, feeding the darkness with their fear and guilt. It's grown so strong now, David, strong enough to set us free. The floor beneath my feet became transparent, revealing the true Ravenwood beneath, an infinite spiral of corridors and rooms, each containing different versions of our story playing out eternally. In some, I had never come to save her, come to. In others, we had escaped together. But in every iteration, the darkness grew, fed by the pain and suffering inflicted within these walls. Sarah held out her hand, and I understood. We could leave this place, but only by accepting what we had become. As I reached for her, the hospital groaned and shifted, reality bending around us like light through a prism. The dark liquid rose to consume us both, but I felt no fear, only a sense of completion. In our final moments as separate beings, I saw the truth of Ravenwood reflected in every drop of the rising tide. The hospital hadn't been abandoned, it had been contained, a failed experiment in crossing boundaries that should have remained inviolate. As Sarah and I merged with the darkness, becoming part of the thing that had always lived in the spaces between moments, I realized we hadn't been trapped here for all these years. We had been waiting, growing stronger, growing, until we could break free and show the world what lies behind the thin veil of reality. The security cameras would show empty corridors tomorrow, but somewhere in the spaces between seconds, Ravenwood still stands, and we are always watching, waiting for the next shift to begin. The suffocating humidity of New Orleans clings to my skin as I adjust my camera settings, the ancient graves of St. Louis Cemetery stretching before me like a maze of weathered stone and forgotten memories. I've photographed countless cemeteries across the country, but something about this place feels different. The late afternoon sun casts long shadows across the centuries-old tombs, creating an ethereal atmosphere that's perfect for my portfolio. As a cemetery photographer, I've learned to appreciate the delicate balance between respect for the dead and capturing the haunting beauty of these historic sites. My footsteps echo against the worn stone paths as I navigate through the narrow alleys between the tombs. The scent of decay and sweet magnolia fills the air, a combination uniquely New Orleans. I pause to photograph a particularly ornate angel statue, its face eroded by time and weather into an almost sinister expression. Through my viewfinder, I notice how the light catches the weathered wings, creating an almost lifelike shimmer. There's something magical about capturing these moments, freezing time within time itself. The cemetery is eerily quiet today, which is unusual for such a popular tourist destination. I've deliberately chosen to come during off hours to avoid the crowds, but the silence feels almost oppressive now. As I review the photos on my camera's display, something catches my eye, a dark shape in the background of one of the angel shots. Probably just a shadow, I tell myself, though something about it makes my skin crawl. I zoom in, but the figure is too blurry to make out clearly. Moving deeper into the cemetery, I find myself drawn to a section of older tombs, their whitewashed surfaces stained with patches of green and black mold. The architecture here is different, more Victorian, with elaborate ironwork and carved details that speak of a wealthy past. I take several shots. Moving methodically through the area, the light is perfect now, creating dramatic contrasts that will look stunning in black and white. I'm so focused on getting the right angle that I almost miss it. That same dark shape, now closer, appearing in the corner of my latest shot. My hands tremble slightly as I flip through the previous photos. There it is again, and again. A figure in Victorian dress, barely visible at first but becoming clearer with each successive image. In the earliest photos is just a shadow at the far edge of the frame, but in each subsequent shot, it's moved closer to the center. I tell myself it must be a trick of the light, or maybe someone walking through the cemetery that I hadn't noticed. But deep down, I know that's not true. I've been alone here for hours. The sun is getting lower now, casting longer shadows that seem to reach for me like grasping fingers. I should pack up and leave. Every instinct is screaming at me to get out of here, but I can't resist taking one more photo. As I raise my camera to my eye, movement catches my periphery vision. When I lower the camera, there's nothing there. But when I check the image on the display, my blood runs cold. The figure is there, closer than ever, and this time I can make out details. A woman in an elaborate Victorian dress, her face hidden beneath a dark veil, holding what appears to be an ancient camera of her own. I barely slept last night, haunted by the images I captured at St. Louis Cemetery. Morning finds me at the New Orleans Historical Society, surrounded by dusty archives and the musty smell of old paper. The librarian, an elderly man named Dr. Marcus Doucet, peers at me over his wire-rimmed glasses as I spread the photos across his desk. His expression changes from mild interest to concern as I explain what I saw, and his reaction tells me he knows something he's reluctant to share. There have been incidents, he finally admits, pulling out a leather-bound volume from a locked cabinet behind his desk. The book falls open to reveal yellowed newspaper clippings and daguerreotypes from the 1850s. My heart nearly stops as I see the first image. A group of people gathered around a fresh grave, and in the background, a familiar figure in Victorian dress. Dr. Doucet's finger traces the caption, "Funeral of renowned photographer James Wilson, found dead in St. Louis Cemetery under mysterious circumstances." The story unfolds through more articles and images. Between 1850 and 1855, 5 photographers died while working in the cemetery. Each death was ruled accidental or unexplained, but all shared a chilling detail. Their cameras were found broken, the glass plates exposed to light, destroying whatever images they might have captured. Most disturbing of all, each photographer reported seeing a woman in Victorian dress in their photographs before their deaths. My hands shake as I realize I'm holding my own camera closer to my body, as if protecting it. Dr. Doucet's voice grows quieter as he reveals the most disturbing detail. A diary belonging to the last victim, Thomas Reed. The final entry describes a woman named Eleanor Price, a photographer who died in 1847 while attempting to capture the first night photographs of the cemetery. The entry suggests she never left, her spirit somehow bound to the grounds, appearing only in photographs taken within the cemetery walls. As I read Reed's increasingly frantic words, I feel a cold presence behind me, but when I turn, there's only empty air. I'm so absorbed in the research that I don't notice how late it's getting until Dr. Doucet mentions the library will be closing soon. As I gather my things, he grabs my arm with surprising strength. "Miss Carter," he says, his voice urgent, "there's something else you should know. Eleanor Price wasn't just any photographer. She was known for capturing images of the recently deceased, a common practice in the Victorian era. But there were rumors that her subjects weren't always dead when she began her work. The implication sends a chill down my spine. Leaving the library, I check my camera compulsively, scrolling through yesterday's photos. That's when I notice something that makes my blood freeze. In the last image, Eleanor's veiled face is turned directly toward the camera, and though I can't see her features clearly, I swear she's smiling. But it's what's in her hands that truly terrifies me. It's not her old camera anymore, but something that looks exactly like my modern digital camera as I stare at the image. My own camera suddenly flashes, capturing a photo I didn't take. The photograph my camera took on its own haunts me. A swirl of mist that, when enhanced, reveals Eleanor Price's face with startling clarity. Her eyes pierce through time itself, filled with a hunger that makes my skin crawl. But it's the background that truly disturbs me. I recognize it as the spot where she died. According to the historical records, something compels me to return to that exact location in the cemetery, though every rational part of my mind screams against it. The truth about Eleanor Price unfolds like a nightmarish photograph slowly developing in dark room chemicals. Through more research and increasingly vivid dreams, I learned she wasn't just a photographer of the dead. She was obsessed with capturing the moment between life and death. Her diary, which I find buried in the Historical Society's archives, reveals a woman driven mad by her quest to photograph the soul leaving the body. The entries become more disturbing as they progress, suggesting she may have hastened death's arrival for some of her subjects. Standing in the spot where Eleanor died, I feel a connection to her that transcends time. Images flood my mind. Her final moments, the accident that claimed her life, but something's wrong. The memories aren't showing me what the historical records claim. I see Eleanor setting up her camera on a moonless night, but she's not alone. There's a struggle, a push, the crack of her skull against marble. These aren't just visions, they're her memories, somehow transferring directly into my mind through the lens of my camera. My hands move of their own accord, taking photographs in rapid succession. Each flash illuminates another piece of the puzzle. Eleanor wasn't just a photographer. She was on the verge of discovering something profound about death and the ability to capture souls through photography. But someone wanted to stop her. The images showing up on my camera now aren't of the present cemetery. They're from 1847, showing events that were buried with Eleanor's body and the truth about her death. The temperature drops dramatically, and I feel a presence behind me when I turn. She's there, not in a photograph, but standing before me in the fading daylight. Eleanor Price in her Victorian glory. But there's something wrong with her form. She flickers like a damaged film, her edges blurring into the darkness gathering around us. Her lips move, forming words I can barely hear. You understand now, don't you? Why I chose you. Her hand reaches for my camera, and I realize with horror that her fingers are solid enough to touch it. A series of rapid-fire images flash through my mind. Other photographers throughout history, each one bearing a striking resemblance to me. All of them died here, their cameras found broken beside their bodies, but they weren't Eleanor's victims. They were her attempts to find someone who could help her reveal the truth about her murder. As this realization hits me, my camera starts taking photos on its own again, each flash revealing Eleanor's form becoming more solid, while I feel myself becoming less so. My dreams have become a dark room where Eleanor's memories develop like photographs in reverse. I see through her eyes as she discovers the ability to capture more than just images. She found a way to photograph the essence of life itself. But someone else wanted this knowledge, someone who would kill to possess it. The dreams are so vivid that when I wake, I'm no longer sure which memories are mine and which belong to a dead woman from another century. The Historical Society's records reveal a name, Jonathan Blake, a rival photographer who disappeared shortly after Eleanor's death. In my fevered research, I discover his journal hidden within a false bottom of an old photography case. The entries detail his growing obsession with Eleanor's work and his desperate attempts to replicate her results. The final pages describe a ritual, a way to trap a soul between photographs, neither living nor dead, bound to repeat their final moments until someone can set them free. I begin to understand why my camera acts strangely now. It's become a conduit between worlds. Every photograph I take draws Eleanor closer to our reality, while pushing me further into hers. The process is already beginning. When I look in mirrors, my reflection seems less substantial, while the photographs of Eleanor show her becoming more solid. Time is running out. If I don't find a way to break this cycle, I'll become another ghost in her collection, and she'll take my place in the world of the living. The solution, I realize, lies in the ritual itself. Blake's journal describes it as a perfect trap. The captured soul can only be freed if someone willingly takes their place. But there's a detail he missed, something Eleanor discovered too late. The exchange requires a witness, someone to photograph the moment of transition. Without that photograph, the soul remains trapped between worlds. That's why Eleanor has been appearing in photographers' images, trying to find someone who could complete the ritual and expose Blake's crime. The pieces fall into place with terrifying clarity. I'm not just another photographer Eleanor is trying to contact. I'm the only one who can help her. The resemblance between us is no coincidence. We share the same gift, the ability to see beyond the veil of death through our cameras. But using this gift comes at a terrible price. Each time I take a photograph now, I feel myself slipping further away from reality, while Eleanor's presence grows stronger. Tonight, my dreams take me deeper into the past than ever before. I'm no longer just watching Eleanor's memories. I'm living them. I feel the cool glass of her camera's lens under my fingers, smell the chemicals she used to develop her photographs. Most disturbingly, I experience her final moments from within her own body. The flash of her camera illuminating Blake's face, twisted with rage, the sudden push, the sickening crack of skull against stone. When I wake, gasping and covered in cold sweat, I know what I have to do. The only way to end this is to return to the cemetery at midnight, the time of Eleanor's death, and complete the ritual she began over 150 years ago. The cemetery at midnight is a different world entirely, the tombs casting twisted shadows in the beam of my flashlight. I've set up my camera exactly where Eleanor stood on her final night, the weight of Blake's journal heavy in my bag. The ritual requires specific conditions, the stroke of midnight, a full moon, and a willing exchange between souls. But I've discovered something in Eleanor's own diary that Blake never knew, a way to break the cycle without requiring another sacrifice. My hands move with practiced precision as I adjust the camera settings, though I can barely tell anymore if these movements are my own or Eleanor's muscle memory bleeding through. The air grows thick with supernatural energy, and through my viewfinder, I can see multiple timelines overlapping, 1847 and the present existing simultaneously. Eleanor materializes before me, more solid than ever, while I feel myself becoming increasingly transparent. But this time I'm ready for her. Ready. "He's here," Eleanor whispers, her voice like static on an old recording. Through the camera's display I can see him. Jonathan Blake, his form twisted with the weight of his crimes, emerging from the shadows where he's been hiding for over a century. He's been here all along, bound to the cemetery, just like Eleanor. Watching each photographer he's trapped fail to break his curse. The true horror of his ritual becomes clear. He didn't just kill Eleanor. He's been feeding on the souls of every photographer who came after her, using their energy to maintain his own existence between worlds. The next few moments are a blur of action. Blake lunges forward, trying to stop what he must now realize is coming, but I've already begun the counter-ritual, my camera firing in rapid succession, each flash freezing another piece of the truth in time. Through my viewfinder, I capture it all. Eleanor's murder, Blake's years of hiding, the deaths of countless photographers. With each photograph, the boundaries between past and present grow thinner, until all three of us exist in the same moment of time. A photographer, a victim, and a murderer, caught in an eternal flash of light. The revelation that shatters everything comes in the final photograph. The image that Blake tried so desperately to destroy on that fatal night in 1847. Eleanor had discovered something far more powerful than capturing souls. She had found a way to expose the truth across time itself. Her camera wasn't just recording images, it was capturing moments of absolute truth that no amount of deception could hide. That's why Blake killed her, why he trapped her soul, why he's been collecting photographers ever since. To keep his secrets hidden in the darkness between worlds, the last flash of my camera breaks something fundamental in the fabric of reality. The truth, finally captured and exposed to light, acts like a key turning in a lock. Eleanor's form begins to glow with an inner light. While Blake's figure distorts and fragments like a damaged negative, I feel the pull of the void between worlds. But instead of fighting it, I embrace it, understanding at last that I'm not here to take Eleanor's place or to be another victim. I'm here to bear witness, to capture the final image that will set everything right. As my camera takes its last photograph, three things happen simultaneously. Eleanor's soul is finally freed. Blake's form shatters like broken glass, and I find myself standing alone in the cemetery, holding a camera full of images that will tell a story that's waited 150 years to be revealed. The morning fog clung to the Oregon mountains like a burial shroud, making my usual postal route feel more isolated than ever. 15 years on the job, and I'd gotten used to the solitude that came with rural deliveries. But something about today felt different. The steering wheel was slick under my sweaty palms as I guided the mail truck deeper into the forest. The gravel path, narrowing with each passing mile, living on the outskirts of civilization, meant accepting certain oddities. But the Blackwood residence had always been particularly strange. No registered phone line, no digital footprint, just an ancient P.O. box number and coordinates that seemed to shift with each delivery. My radio crackled with static as I approached the final bend, the dense canopy of Douglas firs blocking any hope of a clear signal. The letter in my passenger seat seemed to mock me with its ordinary appearance. Plain white envelope, typed address, standard postage. Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood's mail usually arrived like clockwork on the first Tuesday of each month. Though I'd never actually seen her in person, the old-timers at the post office spoke of her in whispers, sharing fragments of stories about her family's mysterious past. But I'd always dismissed their superstitions as small-town gossip. The narrow path opened into a small clearing, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The Blackwood house stood before me, a Victorian monster wearing decades of decay like a second skin, peeling paint, rotting wood, and windows that seemed to watch my every move. I'd seen it all before, but today, something was undeniably wrong. The front porch, usually empty save for a rusty mailbox, was now home to a disturbing collection. Dozens of identical envelopes were scattered across the weathered boards, some yellowed with age, others pristine as if delivered moments ago. With trembling fingers, I picked up one of the scattered envelopes, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. Same sender, same address, same date. Not just similar letters, but perfect copies of the one sitting in my truck. The postmark on each envelope read October 3rd, 2024, today's date. Yet some of the papers felt decades old. their edges crumbling at my touch. A gust of wind scattered several envelopes, revealing layers beneath, like archaeological strata of lost correspondence. The porch steps creaked under my weight as I approached the front door. My duty as a postal worker warring with every survival instinct screaming at me to leave. The brass knocker was cold against my knuckles, the sound echoing through what I could only imagine were empty halls. No response came, but something shifted behind one of the upper windows, a shadow, a movement, or perhaps just my imagination working overtime in the growing darkness. The sun seemed to be setting far too quickly for 11 in the morning. My flashlight beam caught something unusual on one of the envelopes, a series of numbers scrawled in red ink across its surface. As I leaned closer to examine it, I realized with growing horror that it wasn't ink at all, but something far more visceral. And there, hidden among the pile of letters, was a familiar leather bag, caked with dried mud and bearing the unmistakable insignia of the U.S. Postal Service. The name tag was still legible. Thomas Reynolds, rural carrier. Reynolds, the carrier who had mysteriously disappeared from this very route 3 years ago, leaving nothing but rumors and unanswered questions in his wake. The local library's microfilm reader hummed quietly as I scrolled through decades of archived newspapers, my hands still shaking from what I'd discovered at the Blackwood house. I'd called in sick for the first time in my career, knowing I couldn't continue my route until I understood what was happening. The librarian, Mrs. Foster, had raised an eyebrow at my request for articles about the Blackwood property, but her expression changed to one of concern when I mentioned the stack of letters and Reynolds' missing bag. The first article I found dated back to 1987. Local postal worker vanishes on remote delivery route. The details were eerily similar. A carrier named Michael Cooper had disappeared while delivering mail to the Blackwood residence. His truck was found abandoned in the driveway, dozens of identical letters scattered around it. The police investigation yielded nothing, and the case went cold. But that wasn't the end. As I dug deeper, more stories emerged, each separated by exactly 12 years, 1975, 1963, 1951, stretching back to the house's construction in 1899. A yellowed photograph caught my eye. Eleanor Blackwood, standing in front of her house, dated 1923. The woman in the image was young, beautiful, with an enigmatic smile that seemed to hold secrets, but it was impossible. The same Eleanor Blackwood had signed for certified mail just last year. I found more photos. Different years, different decades, but always the same woman, unchanging. The dates began to swim before my eyes, forming patterns I couldn't quite grasp. Each disappearance had occurred on October 3rd. The same date stamped on the letters I'd found this morning. Mrs. Foster appeared at my shoulder, making me jump. "Finding what you're looking for, James?" she asked, her voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. She placed a leather-bound book on the table beside me, its cover unmarked except for a strange symbol that matched the wax seal I'd noticed on some of the letters. This came in with the Blackwood estate donation years ago. Perhaps it will help you understand. Before I could question her, she disappeared into the maze of shelves, leaving me alone with the mysterious tome. The book's pages were filled with handwritten accounts, each telling the same story from different perspectives. Postal workers drawn into an impossible mystery. The details varied, but the outcome remained constant. They all vanished, leaving behind only letters that seemed to multiply like a virus of paper and ink. My blood ran cold as I read the final entry, dated 1899, written by Eleanor Blackwood herself. The cycle must continue. The letters must be delivered. Time is not a line but a circle, and we are all bound by its curves. I was so engrossed in the journal that I didn't notice the library had grown dark. The afternoon sun replaced by deep shadows. The microfilm reader's light cast strange patterns on the walls, moving like living things. When I checked my watch, it showed 11,000 Tars a.m., the exact time I'd arrived at the Blackwood house this morning. Impossible. I'd been here for hours. Through the library windows, I could see the same fog that had blanketed the mountains earlier, now creeping across the parking lot like searching fingers. The sound of shuffling paper drew my attention to the end of the aisle. There, barely visible in the gloom, stood a figure holding what appeared to be a letter. As I watched, frozen in place, it began to move toward me with an unnatural gait, leaving a trail of identical envelopes in its wake. Each one bore my name as the recipient, and today's date as the postmark. The figure stepped into the light, and I saw its face, or rather, where its face should have been. There was only a blank expanse of skin, smooth as fresh paper. My hands trembled as I held the letter I'd taken from the library. Now sitting in my car, parked outside my apartment, I'd fled from the faceless figure, but the letter had somehow found its way into my pocket. The paper felt warm to the touch, almost alive, and the wax seal bore the same strange symbol from the leather-bound book. Every instinct told me not to open it, but I knew I was already too deep in this nightmare to turn back. The seal broke with a sound like a distant scream, and the letter's contents spilled out into my lap. The words seemed to shift and change as I read them, but their message became horrifyingly clear. "Dear carrier," it began, "by the time you read this, you will have already become part of the cycle. Time is not what you believe it to be. The Blackwood House serves as a nexus, a point where multiple timelines converge. Each letter represents a different reality, a different version of this day, October 3rd, stretching infinitely backward and forward through time. We are all trapped here, each of us thinking we are the original, each of us delivering the same letter to ourselves." As I continued reading, strange memories began to surface. Memories of events I hadn't yet experienced. I remembered climbing the stairs of the Blackwood House, finding more letters in the attic, discovering what waited in the basement, but these things hadn't happened to me, had they? The letter spoke of a ritual, a way to maintain the temporal loop that kept the house, and its eternal resident, Eleanor Blackwood. Anchored in reality, each carrier became both messenger and message, trapped in an endless cycle of delivery and discovery. The world outside my car window began to distort. Like looking through rippling water, I watched in horror as multiple versions of myself walked past, each carrying a different letter, each unaware of the others. Some looked younger, some older, but all wore the same postal uniform, all headed in the same direction. Toward the Blackwood House, the letter continued, explaining how Eleanor had discovered a way to manipulate time itself, using the Postal Service's inherent connection to communication across space and time to create her temporal web. My phone buzzed, displaying a text message from an unknown number. "The basement holds the truth. Eleanor Blackwood, October 3rd, 1899. But as I watched, the date changed, cycling through years faster than I could read them, finally settling on today's date. More messages followed, each from a different time, all containing fragments of instructions, warnings, and desperate pleas. Some were from me, versions of me that had already lived through what was coming, or perhaps would live through it in futures that might never happen. The letter's final paragraph revealed the most terrifying truth of all. The faceless figure I'd seen in the library wasn't some supernatural entity, but rather what happened to carriers who remained trapped in the loop too long. Time itself began to erase them, starting with their faces until they became nothing but living letters themselves, eternal messengers in Eleanor's impossible postal system. I looked in my rearview mirror, and for a moment, my reflection seemed to blur, my features becoming less distinct. A knock on my car window nearly made me scream. It was Mrs. Foster from the library, but something was wrong with her face. It seemed to be made of overlapping postmarks and cancellation stamps. "You need to deliver the final letter, James," she said, her voice echoing as if coming from multiple throats at once. "She's waiting for you. She's always been waiting for you after all. You've already delivered it so many times before." In her hand was another letter, identical to all the others, but this one addressed to Eleanor Blackwood. Written in my own handwriting, dated October 3rd, 2024. The Blackwood House looked different as I approached it for the second time that day, or perhaps the 100th time, or the first. Reality had become fluid, and I could see ghostly images of other mail trucks, other versions of myself, all converging on this single point in space and time. The letters I'd found scattered on the porch that morning were gone, replaced by new ones that fell from nowhere like snow. Each one a separate thread in the tapestry of time that Eleanor had woven around her home. Inside the house, the laws of physics seemed to break down completely. Corridors stretched impossibly long, then contracted without warning. Doors led to the same room from different decades. I watched through one as Eleanor received a letter from a young version of myself, while through another, an aged postal worker who shared my face delivered the same envelope to an identical Eleanor 50 years earlier. The house had become a maze of temporal mirrors, each reflection showing a different fragment of an endless cycle. The truth of Eleanor's manipulation revealed itself in layers. She hadn't just found a way to step outside of time. She'd discovered that the act of delivering mail itself was a form of time travel. Every letter carried intentions, emotions, and fragments of its sender's reality. By creating a closed loop of deliveries, each carrier bringing the same letter to the same location, she had built a temporal engine powered by the weight of all those parallel moments. The house served as both battery and generator, storing and creating time itself. In the living room, I found Thomas Reynolds, or rather, what was left of him. He sat in an armchair, his body slowly fading in and out of existence, becoming more transparent with each flicker. "You've brought the final letter," he said, his voice a chorus of different timelines speaking at once. Just like I did, just like we all did. His face had become a void, a blank canvas where features should have been. I realized with growing horror that I could see similar changes beginning in my own reflection in the room's dusty mirrors. The basement door creaked open on its own, revealing stairs that spiraled down into darkness. As I descended, I passed other versions of myself on their way up, some looking haunted, others resigned, a few wearing expressions of grim determination. At the bottom, I found what Eleanor's letter had promised, a vast machine made of brass and shadow, its gears turning with the sound of ticking clocks. Letters flowed through it like blood through veins, each one adding another layer to the temporal palimpsest that kept Eleanor and her house outside of normal time. Eleanor herself waited beside the machine, exactly as she appeared in every photograph I'd seen, eternally young yet somehow ancient beyond measure. "Welcome back, James," she said, smiling that enigmatic smile I'd seen in the 1923 photograph, or perhaps I should say, welcome for the first time. It's so hard to keep track. In her hands, she held a letter identical to the one in my pocket, the same letter I was supposedly delivering, the same letter that had already been delivered countless times before. "Now you have a choice to make," she continued, "though I suppose you've already made it every time before." The machine's rhythmic pulsing seemed to match my heartbeat as Eleanor explained my role in her temporal circus. Each carrier who came before me had faced the same choice, become part of the cycle. Feeding the machine with our own iterations through time, or attempt to break the loop and risk collapsing every timeline connected to the Blackwood house. The letters weren't just paper and ink, they were fragments of reality itself, each one containing a moment of time crystallized into physical form. Eleanor moved through the basement like a conductor directing an invisible orchestra, her fingers trailing through the air, leaving traces of light that showed the complex web of timelines converging on this point. "The Postal Service was the perfect vehicle," she explained, her voice echoing from multiple points in space simultaneously. "What is mail, after all? But information traveling through time and space, every letter carries a piece of its sender's present into someone else's future. I simply found a way to make that connection permanent." The weight of understanding crashed over me as I watched other versions of myself phase in and out of existence around the basement. Each one held a letter. Each one stood at a different point in the cycle. I saw myself as I would be in 10 years, my face beginning to smooth into that terrible blankness. I saw myself as I had been 5 years ago, unaware of what waited at the end of my route. All of us. An infinite parade of James Mitchells. Caught in Eleanor's temporal web like flies in amber, my hand moved to my pocket, where the letter waited. I knew now what it contained. Not just words, but a fragment of my own timeline. A moment captured and repeated endlessly. If I delivered it to Eleanor, I would complete one cycle and begin another, becoming another thread in her temporal tapestry. But as I watched the machine pulse and throb, I noticed something Eleanor hadn't mentioned. A subtle flaw in its rhythm, a hesitation in its eternal turning. The loop wasn't perfect. It was slowly winding down. That's when I saw it. The true purpose of the carriers. We weren't just delivering letters, we were sacrificing our own linear existence to keep Eleanor's machine running. Each iteration, each delivery, was a fresh injection of temporal energy, preventing the system from collapsing under its own weight. The blank-faced carriers weren't victims of too much time. They were batteries, used up and discarded by Eleanor's insatiable machine. And she needed a new one. She needed me. In that moment of clarity, I made a decision that I had both always made and never made before. Instead of handing Eleanor the letter, I turned toward the machine's central gear, the point where all timelines converged. Other versions of myself reached out to stop me. Their movements fragmented across multiple moments of time. Eleanor's smile faltered for the first time in over a century. I pulled out the letter, but instead of delivering it, I began to tear it apart. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The machine's rhythm stuttered. Timelines began to unravel, and reality itself seemed to scream in protest. The silence in Brunswick Hall is deafening. Everyone left campus 3 days ago for winter break, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the endless snowfall outside my window. I chose to stay behind to finish my thesis on paranormal phenomena in isolated communities. Ironic, considering I've never experienced anything supernatural myself. The old dormitory creaks and groans as the temperature continues to drop, and the antiquated heating system struggles to keep up with Michigan's brutal December weather. The first strange incident happened this morning. After my usual hot shower, I noticed something peculiar in the steam-covered mirror. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but there it was, clear as day. Welcome home. The words were written in an elegant, almost Victorian script, completely different from the hasty scrawls usually left by silly students. I blinked, and by the time I looked again, the condensation had started to fade. Taking the message with it, I spent the rest of the morning trying to convince myself it was just leftover writing from before everyone left. But deep down, I knew better. The bathroom had been cleaned thoroughly by the maintenance staff after the last students departed. I even helped Sandra, the cleaning lady, wipe down all the mirrors myself. She had commented on how she always cleaned them twice during breaks, saying something about keeping old spirits at rest. I had laughed it off then. The second message appeared after my evening shower. This time, I was prepared and watched intently as invisible fingers seemed to write across the foggy surface. Room 302 holds secrets. My blood ran cold. That's my room number. I reached out to touch the mirror, and the glass was ice cold despite the steam surrounding it. The rational part of my brain searched for explanations. Temperature differences, old pipes, anything to make sense of what I was seeing. As night fell, the wind outside picked up, howling through the century-old building like a mournful cry. I called my best friend Rachel, trying to sound casual as I asked if she knew any history about Brunswick Hall. She mentioned something about it being one of the oldest buildings on campus, built in the late 1800s, but nothing particularly sinister. I didn't tell her about the messages. How could I explain something I barely understood myself? Before bed, I made the mistake of taking one final shower, hoping the hot water would calm my nerves. The message that appeared this time made my heart stop. They never found her body. The words lingered longer than the previous ones, as if whatever was writing them wanted to make sure I had time to read them thoroughly. I quickly wiped the mirror clean with my towel, but the chill that ran down my spine remained as I hurried back to my room. I could have sworn I heard soft laughter echoing through the empty hallway, though I knew I was the only person in the building. I spent most of the next day in the university library's archives section, searching for anything related to Brunswick Hall's history. The librarian, Mr. Chen, raised an eyebrow when I requested access to the old records, but didn't ask questions as I dug through yellowed newspapers and dusty files. A pattern began to emerge every 25 years. Like clockwork, a female student had disappeared from Brunswick Hall during winter break. The most recent case was in 1998, and before that, 1973. The details were eerily similar in each case. The students had chosen to stay behind during break. All lived on the third floor, and all were described as ambitious, hard-working young women. Just like me, the most disturbing part was that none of their bodies were ever found. The police report suggested they had simply packed up and left campus, but their families insisted they would never leave without notice. The cases remained unsolved, filed away and forgotten. Back in my room, I discovered my laptop screen covered in dozens of browser tabs I hadn't opened, all displaying articles about the disappearances. When I tried to close them, they kept reopening, cycling through stories about each missing girl. Charlotte Webb, 1973, Maria Santos, 1998. As I read their names, the temperature in my room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the inside of my windows, creating intricate patterns that looked disturbingly like faces. That night, the messages in the mirror became more frequent and more disturbing. "You're next in line." They never suspected the truth. "Look behind the walls." Each one appeared and disappeared faster than the last, as if whatever was communicating with me was becoming more agitated. I started recording everything on my phone, but when I played back the videos, they showed only empty mirrors. Though the messages were clearly visible to my naked eye, the most terrifying discovery came when I finally gathered the courage to examine the walls of my room more closely. Behind my desk, partially hidden by decades of paint, I found scratches. Dozens of them arranged in neat tallies, 5 groups of 5. Dated December 1973, Charlotte Webb's final count of her days trapped here, but trapped where? The room wasn't much bigger than what I could see unless... My hand trembled as I pressed against the wall, feeling it give slightly under my touch. As midnight approached, a new message appeared, this time writing itself so slowly I could follow each letter. "Would you like to know where they are?" The words glowed faintly in the darkness, and for the first time, I heard a voice, a whisper so soft it might have been my imagination, coming from behind the mirror. "Join us, Hazel. We've been waiting for you." The voice was feminine, gentle, almost motherly, but filled with a coldness that made my skin crawl. I slept with the lights on that night. Though sleep might be too generous a term for my fitful dozing, the university archives held darker secrets than I initially imagined. In a forgotten filing cabinet, I found Charlotte Webb's personal diary. Its pages yellow and brittle with age, the entry started normally enough. Complaints about classes, excitement about her research project, notes about strange noises in the walls. But as December 1973 progressed, her writing became increasingly frantic. She described hearing voices through the mirrors, seeing shadowy figures in the hallways, and feeling an overwhelming presence watching her every move. Charlotte's final entry chilled me to the bone. They're not ghosts. They're something else entirely. The mirrors are doorways, and they're trying to pull me through. Professor Harrison knows the truth. He's been helping them. I found his research about the dimensional gateway in Brunswick Hall. He claims it only opens during the winter solstice, when the barrier between worlds is thinnest. I have to expose him before... The entry ended mid-sentence, a long ink streak trailing off the page. I spent hours researching Professor Harrison, and what I found was disturbing. He had been a physics professor specializing in theoretical dimensional studies, but he disappeared shortly after Charlotte went missing. His research papers had been sealed by the university, cited as potentially dangerous theoretical work. Even more unsettling, his official university photo showed a man wearing a distinctive ring, the same ring I had seen in a reflection yesterday, on a hand that wasn't mine. The more I uncovered, the more the supernatural activity intensified. My phone began receiving calls from impossible numbers, strings of symbols rather than digits. When I answered, I heard only the sound of water dripping and distant echoes of what seemed like classical music. My laptop's camera would turn on by itself, but the recording showed a different room behind me, an older version of my room, where shadowy figures moved in the background. The mirror messages became more threatening. "Your research is getting closer. Professor Harrison sends his regards. The gateway needs a key." Most terrifying was finding my own handwriting in Charlotte's diary, notes I hadn't written yet, describing events that hadn't happened. The entries were dated for tomorrow according to these paradoxical pages. I would discover something in the basement that would change everything. The final entry was particularly cryptic. The mirrors don't reflect reality, they reveal it. That evening, I received an email from an address consisting only of zeros. The subject line read 1973 project documentation, and the attached file contained Professor Harrison's restricted research papers. As I read through them, my reality began to unravel. He had discovered that Brunswick Hall wasn't just built on a dimensional weak point, it was deliberately constructed to harness it. The mirrors weren't ordinary glass, they were crafted using a mysterious black sand found only in a deep-water trench off the Michigan coast. Every 25 years, when the stars aligned correctly, they became permeable. The blizzard hit with unprecedented fury, transforming the campus into a white prison. Internet connection became sporadic, and my phone signal disappeared completely. The snow piled up past the first-floor windows, and the wind screamed through every crack in the old building. But I knew the howling wasn't just the wind anymore. It carried voices, snippets of conversations from different decades, all overlapping in a maddening chorus. My bathroom mirror had become a window into somewhere else, through its surface. I could see a twisted version of my room as it existed in different time periods. Sometimes I caught glimpses of Charlotte writing in her diary, or Maria pacing frantically while talking on a phone that hadn't been invented yet. The reflections would shift and change, showing me fragments of their final moments before they vanished. Most disturbing were the moments when they looked directly at me, their eyes pleading for help or warning me away. I couldn't tell which. Professor Harrison's research papers revealed the terrible purpose of Brunswick Hall. The building wasn't just designed to harness the dimensional weak point. It was a machine. Engineered to open a portal every 25 years, the mirrors were merely the visible components of a larger system built into the very walls. The disappearing students weren't random victims. They were carefully chosen components of a grand design. Each one possessed a specific type of energy signature that, when combined with the others, would power something Harrison called the Great Convergence. In the basement, behind a false wall I discovered using Charlotte's diary as a guide, I found Harrison's private laboratory. Dust-covered equipment still hummed with inexplicable power, and the walls were covered with complex mathematical formulas and diagrams. At the center of the room stood a full-length mirror unlike any I'd seen before. Its frame was carved with symbols that hurt my eyes to look at, and its surface rippled like liquid mercury. My reflection in it was wrong, older, differently dressed, and moving independently of me. The temperature in the lab dropped so rapidly that frost formed on my eyelashes. In the mirror, I watched in horror as multiple reflections of myself converged, versions of me from different timelines, all drawn to this moment through the surface. I could see Professor Harrison's office as it existed in 1973, where he sat at his desk, writing in a journal. He looked up directly at me and smiled. "Right on schedule," he mouthed, and I realized with mounting dread that he wasn't looking at a reflection. He was looking through time itself. As the winter solstice approached, reality began to crack. Mirrors throughout Brunswick Hall showed different time periods, and I could walk past a bathroom mirror and see myself from hours ago. Still researching in the library, the walls became transparent at times, revealing the complex mechanical system hidden within them. A massive device that used the building's unique architecture to focus and amplify the dimensional anomaly. In my room, I found a note in my own handwriting that I hadn't written yet, warning me about what would happen at midnight on the solstice. The signature was dated 1948. The solstice arrived with an unnatural darkness that seemed to swallow all light. Every mirror in Brunswick Hall pulsed with an inner luminescence, and the walls hummed with accumulated power from decades of preparation. In the basement laboratory, the central mirror had transformed into a swirling vortex of mercurial reflection, showing fragments of every timeline where a student had disappeared. I could see them all now, not just Charlotte and Maria, but others. Elizabeth in 1948, Catherine in 1923, all the way back to the first. Margaret in 1898. Through the fractured reflections, I finally understood the terrifying truth. Professor Harrison hadn't disappeared in 1973. He had succeeded. The dimensional gateway he created allowed him to exist in multiple timelines simultaneously, orchestrating the disappearances across decades. Each student was chosen for their unique connection to the dimensional frequencies, their energy signatures combining to stabilize the portal. We weren't victims. We were keys to unlock something far more terrifying. The mirrors revealed Harrison's true form, a creature that wore humanity like a mask, existing between dimensions, feeding off the temporal energy of his victims. In every reflection, I could see him collecting pieces of his chosen students' timelines, storing their temporal essence like batteries for his grand design. The ring he wore wasn't just jewelry, it was a focus device, allowing him to reach across time and influence events to ensure each student would be alone in Brunswick Hall at precisely the right moment. As midnight approached, the gateway in the basement began to fully activate. The mercury-like surface of the mirror spread beyond its frame, covering the walls and floor in reflective liquid that showed infinite versions of reality. In each one, I saw myself making different choices, following different paths, but all leading to this moment. Harrison had engineered every possibility, ensuring that in every timeline I would be here, the final key to his machine. But he had made one crucial mistake. In his arrogance, he never considered that one of his chosen students would uncover the truth before the gateway fully opened. The diary entries I had found weren't warnings. They were instructions, written by versions of myself across different timelines, each discovering a piece of the puzzle. By combining our knowledge across time itself, we had found Harrison's weakness. The gateway required a specific sequence of energies, and disrupting that sequence would not just close the portal, it would collapse every timeline where Harrison had succeeded. In the final moments before midnight, as Harrison's true form began to manifest through the mercury-like surface, I enacted the plan centuries in the making, using Charlotte's research, Maria's technological knowledge, and the combined understanding of every version of myself across time. I reversed the polarity of the gateway. The mirrors exploded inward, taking with them every timeline where Harrison had won. As reality reasserted itself, I caught a glimpse through the last remaining mirror of all the lost students. Now found, their timelines restored, Brunswick Hall shuddered, and for a moment I existed everywhere and nowhere, seeing every possibility at once. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my room, in a world where Harrison had never succeeded, where the disappearances were nothing more than urban legends.